From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, presented by the Center for American Institutions. And joining me today, he's back on the show. He's been away for a while, and he's joining me all the way from down the hall. Dr. Joel Webster, thank you very much for joining.
Always a pleasure.
Well, so this is going to be fun. I was trying to think of a really good way to bring Joel on the show that wasn't dealing directly with 1920s, 30s, and 40s U.S. Southern politics, which is the sort of episode that he and I can do, and nobody else will be able to follow. But one of the key figures that we teach here at the Center for American Institutions in our Foundations of Democracy class is Thucydides. And of all of us here, the one who I really think understands Thucydides the best and has engaged the most with him is Joel. And he's engaged with Thucydides as much as any non-specific Thucydides expert that I think we're likely to find. So Joel, I hope you're okay if we talk about Thucydides today.
Yeah, I'm ready for it.
All right. So Joel, can you give people, Thucydides is one of those names that I think anybody who's read a little bit of political philosophy, read a little bit of political history, anybody who's wound up here for whatever reason has probably heard the name Thucydides. Could you maybe give us a little bit of a background as to who Thucydides was and why we still know him today?
Yeah. So Thucydides is one of the very famous Greek authors, scholars, historians. He had actually lived many lives. He was a general as well. I'll get to that here in a second, but he's important because we have this written record. So like a lot of these folks, like Herodotus, some of these other folks that we get either snippets of or we get the entire work from, this is one of those great lenses into the past. And so with Thucydides, he's unique though, because he attempts to make this a very kind of scholarly effort. And he embarks on this path, writing during and then kind of as the Peloponnesian War is continuing. And he grows up outside in a demos, a suburb of Athens, though there's enough record that we think that his family actually had Thracian background, so the northern part of Greece there, kind of higher up than Alexander the Great would have come from and all that, further up the coast. Though again, there's some speculation on that. So, but there's a good chance that that's the case. And so we have this record of this man who not only is writing about the Peloponnesian War, he actually fights in the Peloponnesian War. He's a general, and part of how his story kind of happens is he ends up getting exiled, which at the time was almost worse than death, because you're tied to land, you're tied to your family, you're tied to these areas, and then you're being cast out. And so he gets thrown out because he fails to protect a Thracian city, actually. Though, as he would tell it, it wasn't his fault, that kind of thing, right? So you get that. But his story then is he's putting together this history as he thinks he understands it, as he sees some of it. But he's unique in that sense because he is Athenian. He grows up in Athens. He is fighting for Athens during part of the war. But then because of his exile, he gets to interact with Spartans as well as many other people in the Greek world. And so he's traveling around. He's actually kind of like doing some interviews with some of these people and trying to track down what's happening. And so we get this very unique lens of this time. Unfortunately, it doesn't complete. The whole saga ends many years before the war actually ends, unfortunately. And so we're not sure why. We assume he died. I mean, that's the biggest assumption, but there's some uncertainty exactly when that was. But the tale doesn't cover the last several years of the war.
Right. We're going to get to the war in a second, but because Thucydides is often referred to as sort of the father of history. Maybe Herodotus gets a little bit of that claim, but I think it's predominantly Thucydides. Are you why do we attribute that name to Thucydides?
So with Thucydides, again, he's trying to take a very kind of almost scientific approach to this. Um, but one of the biggest things that sets him apart from, say, Herodotus or some of the earlier writers, too, is he tends to focus on the human element of it. So not that he doesn't ignore how humans think about the gods or how traditions or other kind of religious, ideas play into it. But for Thucydides, the gods are not directing events. It's the humans themselves acting out these things, making these choices. And so nothing gets really attributed to that. And it's not, again, that he ignores it, because he'll talk multiple times where certain, Greeks will say, this is happening, or this is a bad omen, or things like that. So he's not rejecting that they care about it, but he's saying that's not what shapes history. So
Right.
that's one big piece. And then the other is,
I was just
well,
gonna say, I just gonna say, like, the Oracle at Delphi
yeah.
is a figure like who matters to Thucydides, but it's not a supernatural
No.
force. And so, for people who've never read Herodotus, but they're probably aware of the Iliad by Homer, where in the Iliad, the gods are major players in the actual story. According, there is no Zeus in Thucydides' work. People are responsible for people's actions.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, continue.
No, you're good. So the other big piece, and maybe what really, I think, kind of sets the stage for future developments and kind of how historians will go about their craft, is he's trying to base everything in fact. He's trying to approach this in terms of getting eyewitness accounts, in case where he wasn't there, because many of these things, especially early in the war, like say the funeral oration of Pericles, there's quite an assumption he was there, he was present for this, so he's probably taking notes on this, or at least trying to remember some of those aspects himself. But some of the other events is he's trying to attract people who were there, people who fought in these battles, or were aware of these events, or played a part in kind of making them happen. And so you're seeing some of this not really remarkable, research type, but you're seeing kind of the oral history tradition. You're seeing some of this attempt to try to, write a factual account. Now, there's obvious some cases where he embellishes a little bit, where, it's like what I think may have happened, say like in the Siege of Milos, and the dialogue there's a lot of assumption that that's not factual. Like what was actually said on that island probably doesn't match exactly what is there, but he was trying to almost write historical fiction in that sense of like, this is how these people probably would have acted, in this moment, or these are the things they might have said based on what they said otherwise, or those types of things.
Yeah, I think in his introduction, he sort of lays out, he says, listen, sometimes I've basically invented dialogue, but I've done it in accordance with what's known about their character and what their interest would dictate they say in this moment.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah, I mean, and I think, what you see here is an attempt at primary sources.
Yep.
Which is different from anything that preceded, at least anything that we've ever uncovered.
Yeah. And not just rely on government sources either. I mean, not just saying like, oh, the government record just says this, this is what we're putting out. It's not even like that. It's, talking to, again, a wider range of participants, essentially.
Right. And approaching sources with skepticism too. It's anyway, I mean, again, Thucydides himself at least believes he's doing something unique.
Yeah.
For the time.
And I think a lot of people since then think so too, because people have been reading him, thousands of years now. And pretty much everyone in the past, I mean, you look at all these other, big names that we think of in literature or philosophy or politics, Machiavelli, people like that, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes. Hobbes himself translates a copy of, the Peloponnesian War. So, I mean, these people read this, people take this seriously, and see this as a piece of kind of the story of, if not Western civilization more broadly, I mean, at least this historical period.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go into the Peloponnesian War itself. This is a very complicated event, but
Mhm.
Dr. Webster, are you able to maybe give listeners who again don't have any familiarity with this a bit of a summary as to what the Peloponnesian War was?
Yeah. I'll try to keep it brief here. So Peloponnesian War arguably should actually be called the second, maybe even the third Peloponnesian War. But we refer to it as the Peloponnesian War. And it breaks out 331 and
BC.
yeah, BC. Uh, well before uh, most of the world that we know existed, right? Or whatever. So in this sense, it, it is essentially a Greek world war. Is that the entire Greek world is going to be kind of subsumed into this? You're going to pull in the Persians, you're going to pull in uh, some people on the island of Sicily and all these types of things, all the way up to uh, essentially where Istanbul is today, historical Constantinople, that whole period. You're going to pull in this entire world, right? But it's really a struggle for superiority, hegemony, right, between the Spartans and their allies and Athens and their allies. Um, and it has several phases. The main one is this kind of this land-based phase, as the Pelopons, the lower piece of Greece where Sparta resides. The troops are going to march up pretty much every year, siege Sparta, and then they're going to march back. And that's largely how the first phase goes. There's not really a decisive battle. There's not a ton of major fighting like we'll see later. And then there'll be a peace that will set in. Most people call it the false peace. And it's actually during this period that Athens is going to foolishly open a second front, and they're going to send troops to try to subdue the rising power of Syracuse on the island of Sicily. And this is also where the famous Million Dialogue, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in a little bit, takes place as well, as Athens is going to invade this tiny island and ask them to subdue. And then eventually the peace can break down. And again, it's largely been breaking down as we see here, kind of proxy wars for several years. But then it's going to open up to this larger naval war. And it's during this time that a really great admiral for the first time maybe in Spartan history will arise, and they will learn how to actually fight on the ocean. And so it'll be major sea battles, and eventually they'll largely destroy the Athenian fleet and siege Athens, break through the walls there, and essentially end kind of the democratic Athenian hegemony. And that's in 404. So
Right. So 433, sorry, 433 to
431.
431
Yeah,
to 404. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, like, this is a 26-year war. It is a very long,
Yeah.
and the false piece is, I don't know, 7 or 8 years in the middle of it. I don't
Yeah,
remember.
roughly. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Athens. I think that's where usually where people start. It's probably people are more familiar with Athens. You mentioned Athenian democracy. How would you describe Athenian democracy?
Well, in some ways, it's very different from most democracy that I think people understand and kind of enjoy today, because it's really, it should not just be called Athenian democracy, it should be called direct democracy. Is that the theory is that you have all these citizens, and again, not everyone living in Athens is Canada citizens, but those who are Canada citizens, the theory is they get to vote, and they get to vote on pretty much anything that happens. And so they're going to come and they're going to meet and they're going to gather and they're going to have their say. And that's the other thing that separates, again, them from a lot of earlier kind of democratic models or systems where you have kind of an assembly or an appella is what they would have called most of them at the time in Greece. Is in Athens, everyone, no matter how poor you were, how rich you were, how famous you were, how much you'd fought or won battles or whatever, in theory, your voice was the same. And so you got to, discuss these things, you got to debate these things. That wasn't common. And so that doesn't happen anywhere really else, until it's kind of introduced by Athens elsewhere. But like places like Sparta, where they do have an appella, they have an assembly of their citizens. They don't get to debate. They don't get to discuss these things. It's put up for a vote and they say yay or nay. In Athens, it's different. The other pieces that people probably aren't going to recognize is that there is no kind of executive that persists. So there's not a president that gets elected for 6 years or whatever. That doesn't happen. Instead, it's mostly kind of 1 year terms for a lot of positions, and there's less that figurehead. So even people, Pericles gets a ton of attention from Thucydides, as well as he's kind of a big name in kind of the broader Greek history as well. But he's not the president. He's a general. He's one of many generals, and so trying to understand that, I think a lot of students kind of struggle to wrap their head around that, because that's not normal for like any state today. We usually have like a prime minister or a president or a king or someone that is like the head of state, and that doesn't really exist in Athens.
Right. And Athens is at the head before the Peloponnesian War and during much of the Peloponnesian War of a major, well, some would say alliance, and others might say empire.
Yeah.
What do you think this is, Joel?
It's definitely an empire by this point. But what's being referred to here is the Delian League, is what it's usually called. Again, Thucydides and most other kind of ancient scholars typically just call it Athens and its allies, or the Athenian League, or something like that. They usually call it, but it's called the Delian League because it initially starts on the island of Delos, where the money is essentially kept. So think of it as like the giant bank for this effort. But it forms in the initial response to the Persian invasions, the very famous ones that I'm sure most people are aware of. But Athens is seen as kind of the lead on trying to resist that and stop that from happening. And yet, once the threat of Persian invasion is gone, well, now they have this power. They don't give it up. And so slowly that starts expanding from, oh, we're friends. We're all in this together. This is kind of like, I don't know, the League of Nations or the United Nations or something like that, is that we're all kind of working together towards a common goal. It becomes oh, well, you want protection. We have this great Navy. Well, you got to pay tribute. You have to pay us money now. And so it becomes this kind of, mafioso type thing. And again, by the time of the Peloponnesian War, it's even a little more complicated than that, because it's kind of become a split where it's almost like the Cold War was, is that you're either, gravitating towards one pole or the other. And in this case, it's Athens or Sparta. And so, you can't be neutral, really.
And I can't remember, by the time the war breaks out, the treasury's off Delos, right? It's been moved to Athens.
It is.
Yeah.
It's been moved to Athens for several years by this point.
Right. Okay. So yeah, you've got this league that has become an empire. And one of the things that is creating turmoil is the fact that it no longer feels voluntary.
No.
And you have this other state rising where, well, actually, I should finish this thought. And Joel, you would know better than I do. Is every state in the Delian League a democracy?
I think at its height, yes, or at least some form of democracy. And again, some cases it's a little different because you have really small islands that are involved too. So it's more like almost like a town council instead of actually like a state running something or something like that. But yeah, I mean, almost everyone that's part of the Delian League becomes or is a democracy typically. And again, I don't know that it was actually like part of the like paperwork they had to sign. It's like, hey, we're a democracy, and we agree to this, or just it was seen as kind of the people who mostly like that kind of became that. But again, some of the rebellions obviously show that even then isn't that
Right.
the case.
And most of these states would have had a quote oligarchic party as well.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So as Athens is getting more and more coercive to its allies, there's this other state. We've talked a little bit about Sparta. What is Sparta like compared to Athens?
Very different, in almost every way. And in some ways, we could just even state this in the sense of if you go to Greece today, you go to Athens, there's a lot of Athens that still looks like the old Athens. There's all these old temples. There's all these old buildings. There's all these old pieces of that are very visible. You go to Sparta, that's not the case. This is a a different type of place in this time where, you know, they're not really building these large temples. They're not really building this massive city. It's kind of much more dispersed. And in part of that, it's because they're heavily reliant on agriculture and via what they called helots at the time, slaves, and that made up the vast majority of the population. And so they were heavily reliant on that as kind of their mass production of goods for both consumption and trade. Um, and then, as I mentioned earlier about their citizens group being smaller, you had these groups that were, I mean, very small percentage of the population called Spartiates, actually. And they were the ones who were the true full citizens, but they were also the true full soldiers, people who had gone through what they call the agoge, this military training that literally started as you were a kid all the way up until really you didn't fully graduate to about 30 from that. And you kind of then could live a real life in theory, even though you're still serving the state basically until you were dead or crippled. It's kind of worked out.
Okay. And I mean, and I think people think of Sparta or today as this to be, for something to be Spartan, for instance, is to be austere, is
Yeah.
to be, and I think when we think of Spartan, we also think of the military. I mean, you mentioned the
Yeah.
agoge, but what is an ordinary Spartan's relationship to the military? A Spartan citizen, a Spartiate.
Yeah. I mean, they are, being a citizen is military service. I mean, there is no distinction in that sense. I mean, you are, you know, taken from your home really early, about 7 usually, ripped from your home. You're thrown out to survive in the wilderness. You're, you know, in this training piece. Then you're also trained by the older boys. And so it's essentially like having, you know, the high schoolers training, you know, the younger kids and, you know, hazing them and beating them and training them, but also building this relationship of, you know, we want the best, right? We want the toughest, we want the strongest, we want the fastest, we want the most capable soldiers to become part of the state. Um, and again, so in that sense, once they graduate, they will continue to live essentially with other soldiers until about 30, and then they will be given land by the state and given helots of their own to manage by the state. So state-owned slaves given to them, and then that's when they start to have kids and all that. But see, this is where part of the Spartan problem kind of arises: is if these are your best soldiers, these are your best citizens, and literally your only citizens. What happens if you lose thousands of these? And so there's actually a point early in the war where a bunch of them get surrounded and eventually looks like they're going to get captured. And the Spartans are about to sue for peace because of this, because they think we can't lose like 1,000 of these men because they haven't either had kids yet or, you know, they won't have kids or whatever. And so there's this burden that other states don't seem to have. I mean, obviously all states don't want to lose thousands of their men in combat or whatever. But for the Spartans, it's literally like losing a piece of the state to a degree. So
Sure. And most of these men are not involved in if you're a Spartan citizen, you're not going to be like a shopkeeper.
no,
You're not going to be you aren't going to have a life that, you might own land, but again, the helots are working the land.
yeah,
Your job is military.
yeah. There's a great scene for those of you who are maybe too young to have actually watched 300, where they're marching up towards Thermopylae, the big battle, and they run into another group of Greeks, and the guy goes, "Where are your soldiers?" to King Leonidas, and he says, "Oh, I brought them." And he's like, "I brought more soldiers than you did." And he's like, the guy looks around and he's surrounded by way more Greeks, it looks like. And so Leonidas looks at one man and goes, "What's your profession?" Right. And asks, and you get like cobbler, you get mason, you get all these other kinds of people answering. And then he turns to his Spartans and he says, "Spartans, where's your profession?" And they go, "Oh," or whatever, this like war chant. That's what they're trained for. That's what they do. And again, not that there aren't men in Sparta who are not soldiers in the true sense, sure.
But they're also not
But
citizens.
but they're also mostly not citizens. And that's the other thing too. I mean, that's what gets lost in, say, 300. It gets kind of ignored, is the Spartans are not just the Spartiate. Actually, the largest bulk of their military in general is the Brachii, these people who are Spartans in theory, but they're not Spartiates, and they're not full citizens. But they have to serve, they have to fight, and they usually live in some of the surrounding villages, on the
Right.
kind of suburb area there.
Right. Um, and they're not a democracy, or at least not what we
No,
consider a democracy.
no.
Who rules in Sparta?
There's actually a great line. I think it's Isocrates wrote this years after the Peloponnesian War, but talked about the Spartans being ruled by a king on campaign, so during military, and then ruled by an oligarchy at home. But in theory, there is a dual kingship that runs Sparta, and both of these dynasty lines are supposed to descend from Heracles or some god, according to the Oracle of Delphi, as we mentioned earlier. And that's how it mostly runs. But then there's this kind of council of people who are elected for life, that they're actually the ones who oversee policy. They're the ones who bring things to the assembly to vote on. They're the ones who will kind of work with the kings on policy directions. They're the ones who are going to receive ambassadors. They're going to do all those things that we kind of attribute to an executive and in some ways a kind of legislative, even quasi-judicial function in some ways. But it, again, there's still that appellate, there's still this assembly. Again, the biggest difference between Sparta and Athens is that the Spartans, there is no debate. When the Pella meets, this Gerousia, this group of oligarchs, they come in, they say, are we going to war with Athens or not? And then it's not even a counted vote, it's a voice vote. Who has the loudest answer in Sparta? And so it's kind of a different system, but it's clear that the input of the citizens matters. And that's what I think gets lost if we just throw out the term, oh, there's oligarchs running Sparta, is that there is a little bit, it's a little more complicated than that. And so I usually try to convey that to students, that there's clearly something different between them and Athens. That's without a doubt. But it is not just a monarchical system. There's not just a king dictating policy or determining things. And it's also not just an oligarchy, because if it was, then the Spartans would have no say. And they at least have, in theory, they get to make a choice. Whether they get to have a good choice or not is a different story. But they get to say, and they get to have a role in that, decision.
Interesting. I actually didn't realize that what mattered was how loud it was. I knew it was a voice vote, but I didn't realize that it was how loud it actually was, so you could manipulate it.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to get that vote going a certain way.
Interesting. All right. So these are the two sides. I mentioned that Athens has this broad-based largely maritime empire. If you take a look at who's a member of the Delian League, it's mostly cities along the coast of the Aegean Sea and the islands and a few other places, but predominantly there. And Sparta has its own empire or league, I guess. Would you describe the Peloponnesian League as an empire, or would you describe it as more of a confederation?
I think it's closer to a confederation, though in some ways it also reflects what we would traditionally think of in kind of a tributary system as well, is that there is still some buy-in, there's still some pay-in, but it's also different, and it's a little more the confederation style because of this piece. And the way I describe it to students is that think of the Peloponnesian League as a wheel, and a spoke piece. The centerpiece of that is Sparta. They are connected to all these other, city-states. But the city-states are not, because this confederation, bound to each other in the same way. So say, like Corinth is attacked or something. Well, Sparta is the only one in theory that has to respond. If another city-state that is also part of this Peloponnesian League, they can decide whether they defend Corinth or some other city-state, whatever. They're not bound in the same way. Whereas in some ways with the Delian League, it's a little more conscripted than that. The Athenians have really built a system where they pull allied soldiers in to do a lot of the fighting. And so they're not even doing it in a individual sense, whereas a lot of the Peloponnesian League functions, I mean, there's still so much autonomy for these states and kind of how they manage both foreign policy, but also military action. Is, Spartans are probably going to be in charge of if there's a battle, but those troops are still going to be led by their own leadership and all that stuff. It's still very much kind of decentralized.
Is that distinction maybe a consequence of the fact that the Delian League was designed in order to counter Persia? Where if one city's attacked, Athens alone is not going to be enough to deal with Persia. You're going to need a massive alliance. Whereas maybe at the Peloponnesian League, the threat is just because of geographic proximity is less likely to be Persia.
I mean, there's probably some of that to it. I think the other piece is because of that Persian legacy aspect, the Delian League is also much more centralized, but it's also dispersed in the sense that Athenian troops and ships are all over the Aegean. Whereas the Spartan soldiers mostly are not being sent out in large part because, as I mentioned, the population disparity, the Helots vastly outnumber Spartiates, Peroci, everything. It's probably like 95% of the population of that area is Helots. And so the concern is what they rise up, what there's rebellion. And so the Spartans tend to not want to venture too far from home in any type of situation.
Right. Okay. And yeah, that's important because I mean, what happens throughout the war is they go on summer campaign, but then they return pretty quickly.
Yeah.
They're rarely away from home for too long, and because if they're away from home, there could be an uprising.
Yeah. Or at least the whole army. I mean, they might send a force like obviously the force that captures Annapolis, the Thracian city that supposedly our old buddy Thucydides failed to defend.
Right.
That was actually captured by a ground force that marched all the way from Sparta up there to capture it. But again, it was minimal size compared to, say, like, it wasn't like the whole Spartan army marched up there.
Okay, so let's get back to Thucydides because we've kind of I wanted to kind of set the scene a little bit, but I do want to bring it back to Thucydides. What does Thucydides say starts the war?
So Thucydides, there's several answers to this. The main answer, though, is that the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, is actually what a lot of people would refer to the Spartan places as. The Sparta is actually the city, not the people. And he says that they were growing fearful of this rising, strengthening, expanding Athenian empire. And so that's what he points to. But there's other things he points to, and he kind of elaborates in several parts of his work about this, that it's clearly other things as well, that it's not just the Spartans. And in many ways, I think it's actually less the Spartans concerned. I mean, not that they aren't concerned, but that it's a lot of these other city-states, especially ones who are closer to Athens, that, consider themselves not part of that Delian League. They're growing concerned of Athens' ability to project power. And their growing sense that, again, in this Cold War type environment, they're having to choose a side, and they feel like they're almost being pressured to switch sides maybe and go to Athens or join that. And so, again, this is what's funny though, and this is why, in some ways, Thucydides is right, but I think he's reducing a very complex issue just by saying that, because, again, this is a conflict that basically since the end of both Persian invasions, Athens and Sparta have been at each other's throats. And, this is not the first time they fight. This might be the last time they fight. And so in that sense, there's clearly animosity. And, if you really get into the nitty gritty details of it too, I mean, there's different ethnicities of Greeks. And so these are two different ethnicities that are also kind of competing in that sense. And some of the, you dig deeper into the religious aspects, they worship different gods of the Greeks and stuff like that. I mean, so there's those aspects that are very much kind of tied up in that. There's also obviously this very clear ideological divide of, like, what would you consider true democracy versus something else. And so how do those work? How should they work? Who should dictate policy in that sense? And I think that is what kind of worries both sides in this is that, especially in the case of the Spartans, is if you're looking out, right? So this is where the fear is real, I think, is if you're looking out, Athens is only growing in its power, not just to project power, but to completely control the ocean. I mean, the entire Aegean Sea, and then as we see, I mean, their ability to, even though it's unsuccessful, their ability to send massive force to Sicily, which for those who are not geographically oriented, that's pretty far, especially at this time for these triremes that you can't really kind of stay on the sea for very, very long. Is the ability to do that well. That's impressive, and if they can do that, well, then they can send their entire fleet and force to Sparta or the allies. And so there's a sense that so much of things are being controlled by the ocean, and now the Athenians, who have always been really good with ships and really good with controlling the sea, now they are the complete master of it. At least that's the perception. And again, this is why it becomes such a big deal when Sparta can finally break that peace. And the irony is that they do so by paying the Persians to build them a fleet, essentially.
Yeah, that's the part of that's the last part of the war. Is that the Spartans pay the Persians so they have a navy that can compete with Athens. But so there's this notion in modern political science and international relations theory. Thucydides is related to this notion of realpolitik, that states interact in a jungle. It's a jungle environment between the various city states. There's no such thing as like international law. Morality doesn't go very far. Each state has its own interests, and they'll ruthlessly pursue those interests. But there's this notion that's recently come up. I think it was Graham Allison who popularized it. This notion of the Thucydides trap.
Yeah.
You and I briefly talked about this a long time ago privately, but I don't know that we really dug into it too far. But I was hoping, Joel, what's your take on this idea? Like, is the Thucydides trap, maybe the Thucydides trap exists, maybe it doesn't, but do you think it's based on a particularly sophisticated reading of Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War?
The simple answer is no. And this is not to disparage Allison. I think good scholar and all that, but this is a question of, I think, misreading a situation, in part because I'm not so sure that, because I mean let me back up here. So the trap itself is essentially the idea that a rising power overthrows a waning power, essentially. And I think that's a misreading of this situation, because I'm not so sure that Athens at this time or after is going to really fit truly a weakened power, or a power that is on the decline or something like that. And nor do I think, depending on certain measurements, that Sparta is the weaker power here necessarily. Because I mean, at a certain level, I think there's a ton of argument to be made that that's part of the problem, is that it's essentially two people fighting over the same piece of land, essentially. And so it's not a weaker power and kind of waning. And compared to some of the other examples he uses in the book that are different kind of transitions of power from maybe one hegemon to another, I don't really think that works. And in part because in many ways, Sparta's not going to last very long either as the hegemon. And so in some ways, that piece doesn't really matter. And I think it's a poor analogy, largely because he's less emphasis on this piece of Thucydides, on the Peloponnesian War, and instead he's really trying to draw analogies to China and the U.S.
Right.
And I think it's a cheap way to try to make a presentist argument about kind of what's happening maybe between the U.S. and China.
Right, and that's the context for the notion of Thucydides trap, is it's to suggest that war between China and the United States is inevitable.
Yeah.
And there's a data set that they use. People like Steve Bannon have popularized it as well on the right.
Yeah.
But it's I think I agree with you, Joel. I don't think it's I think it's trying to make the China-US situation fit the Athens-Sparta situation. I don't think it particularly does. I've always been confused, like the notion is like the emerging, that the pre-existing power sort of feels its power threatened by the emerging power and therefore declares war on the emerging power. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Joel, isn't it Sparta that starts the war?
Uh, it's a little more complicated than that, but yes. I mean, essentially, it's Sparta's the one who will lash out. And so the other piece too, for me, the real politics side of things actually I think makes more sense in that this is a great power competition. Is that these are two states who are looking at the same piece of cake and they're like, this is mine. Um, and not being happy with kind of how that power dynamic plays out. And again, you can see this beyond this moment too, is that this isn't just how this will play out with Sparta and Athens, but how it's going to play out with Thebes when they become the rising power. And then when Macedon finally marches south and takes over all the Greek territory and all this stuff. I mean, it's the same dynamics over the same kind of territory. So that's kind of how I would look at it. But to me, it's a great power politics. And, he says later in his work, not so much specifically about this moment when this war breaks out, but when he's talking about why people fight or why wars occur, he says it's fear, honor, interest. And I do think he's accurate on those. I think that those, either one or all of those, tend to be the reason why wars will break out, is someone is scared. And in this case, I do think Sparta is scared. I think in particular, the allies of Sparta are scared too. But I think there's that honor piece. I think both of them are like, we are clearly the honorable one. We clearly have the more high ground. We clearly are the better soldier. We're clearly the better ruled empire or whatever. And then the interest, of course, is that Sparta's concerned about being kind of constrained by this naval power that can kind of cut off the Peloponnesus from the outside world.
Right. All right. We've taken 40 minutes, and I want to do the million dialogues before we go any further. I was hoping to do a couple of other things, but I think I want to make sure we hit the greatest hits to make sure that we get that in. Because if there's one piece that anybody has read from the Peloponnesian War, from Thucydides' work, it's the Melian dialogues. Joel, can you walk us through the Melian dialogues?
Yeah. So Milos is this fairly substantial island, kind of off the Peloponnesus, kind of southeast of Athens as well, but pretty much kind of within a day or two's journey maybe of both these city-states. It had also been founded by a colonist of Sparta. So many years in the past, they had settled this island and established it. According to kind of some of the historical record, it was pretty wealthy in some sense. It wasn't a very large island compared to some of the others like Lesbos or some of the other islands on the other side of the Aegean, but they had a lot of mines and they had a lot of ore and they had a lot of valuable things like that for military efforts. But it becomes a central piece of the story because during the first part of the war, and so I think this is about 426, Athens tries to conquer Milos, and then there's another island or two right nearby, even smaller, that Athens wants to conquer again as a stepping stone to kind of invade the Peloponnese and invade Sparta and some of its neighboring allies. And so they try, they fail, and they don't really bring their full effort to do so, but they fail. And so during this false peace that we mentioned, Athens is going to come back. They're going to send a larger fleet, and they're going to show up. But instead of just declaring, we're going to take you, the setup is that they show up and they kind of send ambassadors and they're like, okay, you join or die. That's essentially, kind of what they're offering. And either being hopeful that the Spartans are going to come to their aid, and or those who had lived through the last invasion about 10 years prior are looking at going, well, we beat you once, we can do it again. So they might be hopeful on that hand too. But the dialogue kind of runs out of, these Athenians talking to these oligarchs of Milos, and you kind of mentioned realpolitik. The Athenians really present this position that like, we are the powerful state. That is that's all that matters. We're going to win eventually one way or the other. And the Melians kind of present this as, a moral thing of, well, that's just not right. You can't just come in here and do this. You can't just take our island like this, or you can't just force us to align ourselves, or whatever. And again, and they do place a lot of hope, I think, in Sparta coming to their aid. But and I hope I'm not jumping ahead by saying this, but I think that there's a big piece of this that I try to kind of get students to think about is, if the Spartans do come, right, this is in the middle of this peace. All that war is not happening. Yes, Spartans are dying. Yes, Athenians are dying. It's happening. Like, that's still happening. But there's not total war. If Sparta shows up in Milos, that war's back on. And so I think it's very presumptuous of the Melians to look around and go, our lives are worth that. Our lives are worth reigniting this world war, essentially. And not saying that, there isn't value to their lives or something like that, but at a certain level, that's what Sparta is deciding, and they clearly decide it's not worth it. And there's some other pieces we could kind of, unpack as well, but that's kind of the big sense. And so what ends up happening is they lay siege because Milos decides not to lay down their arms, not to give in. Athens besieges them, lasts for almost a year, and then they finally get fed up. And once they get inside Milos, the city itself, they sell off all the women and children to slavery. And according to the most translations, all the men are killed, but some of the translations paint it actually as not all men, but military age men. And so there might be a stipulation on exactly who dies fully, but most of Milos is either sold in slavery or dead at this point. Athens then takes over the mines and gets all the ore that they really wanted, as well as, again, and again, probably jumping ahead too much in this, but there's several reasons for this. One of the big ones being, if they are the kings of the sea, and there's an island that big, that close to Athens that they don't control, or that isn't paying tribute or isn't somehow aligned to them, that looks weak.
Yeah, because Athens' whole identity at this point is wrapped up militarily in being the masters of the sea. They would willingly acknowledge that Sparta might have better land forces than they do, but they know that they have the sea. And they believe, well, I mean, there's some distinction there. Pericles says all you should care about is the fact that you're the masters of the sea, right?
Yeah.
And perhaps later Athenian leaders try to take some of that investment away and put it into land forces, which is maybe one of Thucydides' arguments as to why Athens doesn't end up winning the war. But as far as Milos goes, yeah, they're the dominant sea power in this war, and their identity is their ability to project power is based on the notion that they control the sea. And if Melos continues to exist as a neutral power, then they clearly don't control the sea, especially a neutral power that is ethnically identical to the Spartans and has a government structure that more closely resembles the Spartans than the Athenian democratic model.
And we have some archaeological evidence since then, too, that Milos had donated or to Sparta's war efforts in their early part of the war.
Right.
About, I guess, 324 or so, that I think was when they supposedly sent some shipment to them. So Milos is claiming that they're neutral and that they're not involved in this and this is not their fight. But in a certain sense, it kind of is. Mm-hmm. And as I said, largely because of that neutrality piece, is that I'm not sure anyone can be neutral in this, is that there is no room for fence sitters in this conflict.
So why has this dialogue been, why do we still study this in international relations classes? Why, if there's one piece of this whole book that people read, it's this section. Why is that?
Well, largely because, again, the Athenian position seems to be kind of a almost might makes right dynamic, which a lot of people have been bringing up, and it's very, present in our current discourse around, say, U.S. involvement in Venezuela or Iran or places like that, is, what right do states have to do things? in their relationship with other countries. And so in this case, the Athenian position isn't just as simplified as that, though. It isn't just, oh, we're powerful, you're not, we do what we can or will or should. But it's also in the sense that I think was pretty standard for much of, U.S. history, world history, even for much of the way the Europeans interacted with each other, is this notion of equal power. And so, Sparta and Athens, they're going to interact differently, and they should interact differently than Milos and Sparta, or Milos and Athens, or Syracuse and either of those states, or any of these other examples we could bring up. Is the power dynamics, you're gonna respond differently in different contexts. And so I think that that's one of those things where it's kind of like treating other kids at the kid table, and then you're going to treat your adults differently, or you're going to treat how you talk to the principal differently. Those types of power dynamics. And the Athenians, at least the way they're presented by Thucydides here in this story, is they see it as that they don't like, their position is essentially they didn't even have to talk to them, right? They could have literally just shown up and taken the city. Mm-hmm. That they were being nice, literally having a conversation with them.
Right. I mean,
that's kind of how it's presented.
I should know the phrase offhand. You'd think I would by now, but it's the strong states do what they will, and the weak states do what they must.
Suffer what they must.
Suffer what they must. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's this idea that Athens. The quote in the Melian Dialogues is something along the lines of, justice only matters when two powers are balanced with each other and are relatively equal. In this case, we are super powerful. You're really weak. What are we going to have an argument about justice for? Just do what we tell you.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, and so, I mean, I do think that this has not only its interest from the Athenian perspective, but I also think people can identify with the Melians a little bit here, in the sense of, what would you do? Your choices are cowardice or extermination.
Yep.
And it's easy, you can try to be heroic, you can try to be honorable, and you can have these wonderful thoughts about, and maybe throw it up to chance. War, fortune happens in war. A storm could have blown in and destroyed the Athenian fleet. Right? Something could have happened. So you could always kind of hope for something, or the Spartans are willing to negate the peace and restart the war. And I think what's useful about this is that, again, it's understood that, like, if you're defeated, there's no tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like, oh, you're going to get to live in kind of a crappy protectorate of Athens. No. It's extermination.
Yeah.
Okay. We've talked about the Melian Dialogues. So what does Thucydides think the point of the Melian Dialogues is? Maybe that's a good question to pivot somewhere else. Why does he bother including it?
I think he seems to be included largely as this example of Athens kind of maybe losing course in his mind. And you see this in part because he talks a lot about how much he's impressed and respects Pericles. Once Pericles dies, he dies in the plague in Athens, actually. He and his sons do. After that, there is no one who seems to be able to kind of speak for Athens in the same way. There's a lot of competing interests. There's a lot of people who try to have their, leadership. Alcibiades is one of them. There's many others that are all vying for trying to control kind of the direction of this war and then the eventual pieces of it. And I think in some ways he sees Melos as kind of this maybe moment of hubris, of this assumption that you're something that you're not, maybe. And again, not just in the context of that specific case either, but also in the broader context of this failed attempt to take Sicily, or to go to Sicily, subdue Syracuse there. And all that seems to kind of point to this fact that, maybe you're becoming something else. And again, a piece of that, um, there's at least some skepticism, I think, from Thucydides about the nature of democracy working, maybe. But more importantly, this is showing how, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the position that democracy is good or democracy works or whatever, is how many Athenians voted on Milos being devastated? As far as we know, nobody. Unless you want to say like they voted for the broader war, or they agreed with, that type of thing, or they agreed with controlling, the sea lanes or something. Like, otherwise, there's not really a vote. Uh, the other piece too, and again, this talks about kind of the framework. We kind of skim some of this, but you get this piece where a lot of these military commanders, even down to like the admiral level, they're appointed usually for like 1-year terms or for the duration of a war in some cases, but then they're always judged. They're always put before the people. If the people of Athens disagreed with what happened on Milos, I think we would have had record of those admirals in charge of that being exiled or fined or maybe even put to death if it were that serious. But we don't have any record of that. Now, as Thucydides not talking about, like, no other record exists of Athens, crying over spilled milk, essentially. We do have record, though, and Thucydides mentions this, actually. Multiple other states, including Thebes and several others, condemning this. And actually, once Athens falls, those same states want Athens to be devastated in the same way. They want it sold off. They want the city destroyed. They want it not to exist anymore. And they see it essentially as kind of, God's punishment for them type of thing, as it's a retribution for, your past sins or whatever. And see, Sparta doesn't do that. I mean, they could have. They easily could have. They tear down the long walls between Piraeus, the port city, and Athens, but they don't tear down Athens, and they don't destroy it. They could have. And so we see, kind of the decisions leading to this, but also the decisions after this, is that nobody's really seeing this as, completely violating norms or violating good or righteous things to do. And in some ways, you can kind of see this again playing back into some of the other speeches that Thucydides brings up, largely from Pericles, talk about the nature of empires, that people are always going to complain. People who don't have the power are always going to complain. They're always going to beg you to be good and righteous and, appeal to their interest, not yours. And in some ways, this story also shows some of that, is that Athens is acting in their interest. Whereas, if they acted another way, would that actually be in their interest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also think that, the losing course thing, I think, is critical here, because it does sort of feel like it comes at a turning point of the book too, where Pericles's perception of Athens, or the way that he describes Athens, is in these sort of beautiful moral terms. And again, Thucydides is not distracted by the fact that, foreign affairs is fought morally or encouraged morally. But I do think he sort of has this notion of what Athens was, and that it was beautiful and that it was wonderful. He's a patriot, ultimately, even though he's exiled.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he has this great respect for what Athens was. And even though he probably acknowledges that the Delian League was coercive, he still, I think, thinks that Athens' strength to some degree depended on not only the respect for Athens' ability to control the sea, but people's general just acquiescence to the fact that, well, Athens is actually kind of awesome, in the Delian League, even if they didn't necessarily, even like, grumble, grumble, grumble. But, it could be a lot worse. We could be dealing with the Persians. But at Milos, you sort of have this moment where the Delian League is looking at Athens and going, are you better than the Persians?
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, at the very end of the story, we get to see what happens because
Right.
we see Lysander basically come in and do the same thing everywhere else in the Aegean, where now instead of, Athenian ships coming into your port, it's now Spartan ships. And instead of the tribute going to Athens, it's now going to Sparta. And
Right.
so in many ways, that proves the Athenian point, and as well as maybe even Thucydides' own point about this, that this is what empires do.
Right.
This is
But
what
that you're,
powerful
however,
states will do,
this is what powerful
right?
states will do. However, it could be in your interest for people to actually kind of like you,
True. True.
even if they don't, even if they maybe grumble, it can still be in your interest to be generally liked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the other thing that would think with Milos is like, again, this isn't happening in a vacuum.
No.
Many of these states or these city states or these islands had been resisting Athens. And so again, if an island like Milos is doing that, that close to home, not on the other side of the Aegean, not like some of the larger states who had basically been given, you know, zero tribute to pay because they were rebelling too much, you know, it's not like that. This is this close to Athens. I mean, you can literally get there in a day, essentially.
Mhm.
If you can, if you can sit there and thumb your nose at this empire, why can't all these other islands? And so, in some ways, this is less about Milos and it's more about making an example. It's more about
Yeah.
showing that th- this isn't about whether Milos has a right to be free or not. This is about if you oppose Athens, you will be crushed.
Right. No, I absolutely think that's the, yeah. Okay. So why does Thucydides, I hope you're okay if we go 10 more minutes. Is that okay?
No, yeah, we're good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, why does Thucydides argue that Athens lost the war?
Well, in part, again, we don't really know fully because that part's actually missing. Um, but it seems to be the fact that they kind of overstretch themselves. Again, this whole opening a second front in theory to Sicily, um, also again seemingly making enemies with the Persians, unlike the Spartans who get them in their good graces, and so they've either through their own interest or through their own fear creation, they've created enough angry people who are willing to come together to fight them, and so in a sense they're unable to build a strong enough coalition to resist that. Um, as well as their own infighting. I mean, there's a brief period 411 where democracy falls in Athens very temporarily, and in part because the oligarchs who are paying the fees, who are paying the large taxes to keep this war running, they they get tired of that, and they get tired of the price of food going up, and the complications of the war, the pressures that war usually puts on people. Right? They get upset with that. They're also losing more lives. I mean, especially after the failure in Sicily. I mean, that was a disaster. I mean, we're talking about disaster on the same scale in terms of like percentage and the impact of, in many ways, say Hitler's fiasco walking into Russia, or Napoleon's fiasco walking into Russia. These types of things where this is you're going to the ends of the earth, you're trying to project power, and you're getting embarrassed, essentially.
Yeah, I think the Napoleon example is a really good one.
Yeah.
Right. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's,
So
I mean, the Hitler one too, but particularly the Napoleon example. I think it's
yeah,
about
yeah, especially time wise for him. I think Napoleon fits better in that sense because it's quicker and two. But there's that sense of like this war being devastating. And so I think most people kind of look at that and look at this moment, look at democracy wavering or maybe temporarily falling and thinking this is the end of Athens. But again, they're gonna persist for almost another 10 years from that moment. And they're gonna come back from, this, and in part they come back because they planned for this. Athens, they didn't send all their ships. They intentionally set aside many of their better ships to make sure that they could still control the sea, even in the wake of this. And then, there's still many moments to it. I mean, it's not set in stone in either Thucydides' telling or simply the historical account of there's multiple times where Sparta could have lost. I mean, literally until the last moment, literally until Lysander standing outside of Athens, literally until that happens, Athens could have still won. They could have still been victorious. They could have still been the hegemon.
Yeah, that's actually
So, I mean,
that's a really important point because I honestly like anytime I've read about the Peloponnesian War, I feel like Athens is on the brink of winning it for 30 years.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
even after what happens in Sicily, they're on the brink of winning it. They're always
yeah.
one big win away from winning it. They control more. They control more strategic territory. They have a, and it's really just the last year
Yeah.
where it honestly looks
Yeah,
like Sparta can even win this thing.
yeah, because I mean, even most of the naval battles that are going to occur in that later phase of the war, the vast majority go Athens' way. They're still I mean, even if they're outnumbered, they're still the better ships. They still have the better crew. They still have all these things, and they just have mostly better admirals, even at that late stage. And even the famous battle, kind of the Dardanelles, that strait between Asia Minor and the European mainland, that section. I mean, again, there's multiple times in that fight where Athens could have won, and they don't, but they easily could have. And so, I mean, it's one of those things where, again, I try to remind students to like read all this is like none of this is preordained. Like that, not this is like looking at the Super Bowl and saying like, oh well, on paper this team looks like they're going to be the best, and just like betting all the money because you assume that Athens is going to win. They control the sea. There's no way this is going to go the other way, and yet that's true in a certain sense. Like we can't discount the data. We can't discount all that stuff. But at a certain level too, is that that's not how the world works. It's not always on paper who's the best or who's the biggest or who's whatever. That's not how things happen. But it also doesn't mean it can't. And so we can't fall into the trap of being like, oh well, this team looks too good on paper. They're not going to. They're clearly not going to go all the way. Can't do.
Or that Sparta was ordained to win for whatever reason
Yeah.
because they shouldn't have.
Yeah.
It anyway. So what Lysander is the victorious Spartan admiral who and he essentially sets the terms for the post-Athenian world. And this goes beyond Thucydides because Thucydides doesn't live to see any of this. But so we're mixing here, and one of the things about this book is that we're mixing in some Thucydides with some of the historical record. They don't always line perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
But so we're gonna, I was gonna call the episode Thucydides, but we're gonna call it Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, I think. But
That's probably
so what happens? Yeah, what happens after the Athenian defeat?
so. The first thing that happens is, as I mentioned, there's these what they call the famous long walls of Athens, because everyone imagines because Athens is a naval power, they're sitting right on the coast. They're a little inland, and they're kind of up on this plateau a little bit. But there's this town called Piraeus maybe, but it's around the coast, and it's actually this port city. And so Athens had these serious long walls, this massive, I mean, huge walls that ran from that port city to Athens, and so they could essentially outlast a siege as long as they controlled the ocean. And that became one of the big reasons of kind of maintaining the new world order, which was to make sure that Athens could never do that again. They could never, sit behind their walls and just wait out a war. And so they tear down those, and then Lysander starts basically flipping the Delian League on its head by going around and becoming now the Spartan League. And they become the hegemon. And most of these city-states and most of these islands and most of these places that have been democratic, that have been democracies, that have been paying tribute to Athens, now they mostly become oligarchs. They mostly become these types of systems. Even again, Athens temporarily will become an oligarchic system again for a very brief period. And then all that tribute. So all the, and again, this is one of those great ironies of history, because the Spartans, in rough translation, their message that they're sending out, and they're trying to recruit allies and get people to support their effort against Athens. They're saying, war to free the Greeks, and we're going to shatter this empire. We're going to free you. You're going to be free. Well, instead it's, Athens is no longer the boss. And now the new boss shows up and says, pay. Right. And so the same kind of thing happens. And in fact, actually, for some of the Greeks, especially those on the coast of the Aegean on the other side, the Asia Minor section, kind of in, modern day Turkey, place like that, a lot of those places, not they don't fall under Spartan control, they fall under Persian control again. And so Persia takes back a lot of its territory that it had lost to the Athenians, and the Greeks in general. And so in many ways, you know, nothing really changes except there's a different flag flying.
Well, I mean, actually, things might have gotten substantially worse.
There's definitely an argument made for that as well.
So yeah, not it wasn't just a no nothing, meet the new boss just like the old boss. It's meet the new boss. He looks like a lot like the much older boss who you got what the other guy to get away from.
Yeah.
So anyway, um how long does this new world order last?
Compared to the old one, very short. I should have actually looked the date up, but I'm actually blanking on the exact date of when kind of the Spartan hegemony is going to end. But it is relatively short, and in part because you're going to have several powers rising up. You're going to have Thebes in particular is going to rise up and is going to become kind of the dominant power in the south there for a while. But I mean, but comparatively, the other dominance, so the Athenian dominance was at least almost 100 years, maybe a little more than that. Spartans is going to be a shadow of that by comparison. I want to say it's probably no more than 25 off the top of my head, maybe 30. It's really not that long. And they're going to be contested throughout. So even though they have control for part of it, there's pieces of it where that control is very minimal. And Athens is even trying to fight it again. And so, I mean, there's some of that where it's far less stable, this new world.
Yeah, I was just gonna say much more unstable, and yeah, and short term. And I just want to go back to the long walls for a second. I think that is worth remembering that, through much of the war, the Spartan forces control much of the Ionian Peninsula,
Yeah.
right, which is where Athens is. But
Yeah.
to Thucydides, there he's like, okay, we control and he says this through Pericles. Okay, we have full access to the sea and we control the water.
Yep.
And so, rampage and pillage till your heart's content.
Yeah. I mean, this is where again, short term, I think it's less of a problem, right?
But it's this is, yeah. And yet that focus, they tend to miss that focus. Anyway, I wanted to bring that up because that's going to be I'm going to end there, but I also want to use that as a selling point for the next time I have Dr. Webster on. I'm not sure it's going to be next week, the week after, something like that, where we're going to talk about the importance of sea power through history.
Yeah.
And whether he likes it or not. And for those of you who know the phrase, you kind of know where we're going with it. But anyway, Dr. Webster, thank you very much for coming on. That was a great discussion.
Yep. Thank you.